Hello everyone, we've reached chapter 21, Conservation and Biodiversity in our Concepts of Biology OpenStax textbook. We'll be looking at 3 sections in this chapter: the importance of biodiversity, threats to biodiversity, and finally, preserving biodiversity. I've included a slide that has our objectives for each section, so feel free to pause and read through those. One of our major problems and threats to biodiversity is habitat destruction through deforestation, especially of our beautiful tropical rainforests, as seen in this satellite view of the Amazon rainforest in Brazil. It's a major cause of the current decline in biodiversity. In our introduction, the current estimated extinction rate is at least 550 times the rate previously seen during times of no unusual geological or climatic events. The previous rate we call the background rate of extinction, and biodiversity will continue to decline with the current rate. Biodiversity is the diversity of species on the planet, and this is going to keep declining in the next century or two. This includes species that we haven't even yet described, not even yet discovered. Many of these will be living in tropical rainforests, which is currently being destroyed by deforestation. From 1970 to 2011, nearly 20% of the rainforest was lost. What's the effects on the loss of biodiversity? Well, it's a huge impact on not just other organisms, but humans as well. Food will be harder to produce. Clean water would be more rare. The rate of development of new medicines will be slower. Biodiversity loss is almost entirely due to human activities, but humans have the ability to reverse this if they make dramatic changes. The question is, can we do this? So first, let's look at the importance of biodiversity. Biodiversity is biological variety. It's originally measured by taking into account both the number of species and the number of individuals in each of those species. And modern ecologists also consider genes, populations, and ecosystems to help focus their efforts to help preserve biodiversity. So we already know there have been extinctions from the past. Do the past extinctions of, say, the organisms like the passenger pigeon, the dodo, or even the woolly mammoth have an impact on us today? Should we care about this? Well, we're likely to see the loss of tens of thousands of species in our lifetime. And loss of biodiversity is likely to have dramatic effects on human welfare through the collapse of ecosystems and in added costs to maintain food production, clean air and water, and to improve human health. Biologists recognize that human populations are embedded in ecosystems and are dependent on them, just as is every other species on the planet. Agriculture makes it hard to recognize our dependence on living things other than crops and the domesticated animals on the planet that we regularly see and rely on. But we have to think beyond just the organisms we use in agriculture and domestication. We have to think beyond to other organisms, even that we don't see on a regular basis, like fish in the ocean, insects in the forests, plants and fungus, even those types of organisms. We have to think outside the box here. So the things our ecosystem provides are called ecosystem services. These organisms and nature provide these services for us, like food, clean water, and medicines. And it's going to be even harder to come by these ecosystem services if we continue to see biodiversity decrease and we destroy habitats. Here's a tropical lowland forest, rainforest in Madagascar. It's an example of a place where we can go to find high biodiversity. This particular location is protected within a national forest, yet only 10% of the original coastal lowland forest remains, and research suggests half the original biodiversity has already been lost. So biodiversity is simply the numbers of species in a location or on Earth. So example, the American Ornithologists Union lists 2,078 species of birds in North and Central America. More sophisticated measures of diversity take into account the relative abundance of species as well. So for example, a forest with 10 equally common species of trees is more diverse than a forest that has 10 species of trees, wherein just one of those species makes up 95% of the trees, rather than them being equally distributed. So biologists have also identified alternate measures of biodiversity, some of which are important in planning how to preserve biodiversity. Genetic diversity. Some scientists consider genetics when considering biodiversity, and genetic diversity is variation, a variation in genes. So this is one alternate concept of biodiversity, thinking about how many genes, how many different genes are in the gene pool of a species. This is the raw material for adaptations in a species. A species' future potential for adaptation depends on the genetic diversity held in the genomes of the individuals in the populations that make up the species. So a genus with very different types of species will have more genetic diversity than a genus with species that look alike and have similar ecologies. The genus with the greatest potential for subsequent evolution is the most genetically diverse one. There's also chemical diversity. This refers to the different assortments of chemicals in a species' cells, proteins, as well as the products and byproducts of metabolism. And humans can use these chemicals for their very own medicines. Like, for example, the drug, can we say this? Eptifibatide is derived from rattlesnake venom and is used to prevent heart attacks in individuals with certain heart conditions. You may not have known that. At present, it's far cheaper to discover compounds made by an organism than to imagine them up and synthesize them in a laboratory ourselves. Chemical diversity is one way to measure diversity that's important to human health and welfare. So diversity in domesticated organisms created from selective breeding is suffering losses because of market forces and increasing globalism in human agriculture and migration. So, for example, international seed companies produce only a few varieties of a given crop and provide incentives around the world for farmers to buy these few varieties while abandoning their traditional varieties, which are far more diverse. The human population depends on crop diversity directly as a staple food source, and its decline is troubling to biologists and agricultural scientists. Another type of biodiversity is ecosystem diversity, the number of different ecosystems on Earth or in a geographic area. So whole ecosystems can possibly disappear. And the loss of an ecosystem means the loss of interactions between species, the loss of unique features of co-adaptation, and the loss of biological productivity that an ecosystem is able to create and even provide for us. For example, a largely extinct ecosystem in North America, right here around our home, is the prairie ecosystem. Prairies once spanned North America from the boreal forest in northern Canada down into Mexico. Now they're replaced by crop fields, pasture land, and suburban sprawl. The hugely productive ecosystem that was responsible for creating our most productive agricultural soils, it's now gone. And as a consequence, soils are now being depleted unless they're maintained artificially, which costs a lot more money to do. The decline in soil productivity occurs because the interactions in the original ecosystem have been lost. And that was a far more important loss than the relatively few species that were driven extinct when the prairie ecosystem itself was destroyed. So here we see some of those examples from the coral reef to the prairie ecosystem. the variety of ecosystems on Earth, help to enable great diversity of species to exist, but because of their destruction, biodiversity is decreasing. Let's take a look at current species diversity. Despite considerable efforts, knowledge of the species that inhabit the planet can be limited. They can be hard to count. So named eukaryote species are about 1.5 million species. It accounts for less than 20% of the total number of eukaryote species present on the planet, which by one estimate is 8.7 million species. Prokaryotic species are largely guesses, but biologists agree that science has only just begun to catalog their diversity. Even with what is known, there's no centralized repository of names or samples of the described species. For prokaryotes, therefore, there's no way to be sure that the 1.5 million descriptions is an accurate number. Annually, there's about 17,000 to 20,000 new species a year described or added to the repositories. Describing a species can be a complex process by which biologists determine an organism's unique characteristics, whether or not that organism belongs to any other described species already known, and may determine if species are valuable to humans or our ecosystems. Looking at patterns of biodiversity. Biodiversity is not evenly distributed on the planet. So here's some examples. Lake Victoria contained almost 500 species of cichlids. It's a family of fish present in the lakes. Before the introduction of an exotic species in the 1980s and 1990s caused a mass extinction there. All of these species were found only in Lake Victoria, meaning they were endemic species found only in this location. Another example, blue jays are endemic to North America, found only here. Endemics with highly restricted distributions like the Barton Springs salamander are particularly vulnerable to extinction. Higher taxonomic levels like genera and families can also be endemic. Lake Huron contains about 79 species of fish, all of which are found in many other lakes in North America. But what accounts for the difference in diversity between Lake Victoria and Lake Huron? Lake Victoria is a tropical lake, while Lake Huron is a temperate lake. Lake Huron in its present form is only about 7,000 years old, while Lake Victoria in its present form is about 15,000 years old, over double. These two factors, latitude and age of the lake, are two of the several hypotheses that biogeographers have suggested to explain biodiversity patterns on Earth. So here we have a map. It helps to illustrate the number of amphibian species across the globe and shows the trend toward higher biodiversity at the lower latitudes. A similar pattern is observed for most taxonomic groups. Looking at the red and the orange, we're going to find this mostly in the equatorial or equator regions. So one of the oldest observed patterns in ecology is that biodiversity in almost every taxonomic group of organism increases as latitude declines. In other words, biodiversity increases closer to the equator. Continuing with patterns of biodiversity, there's hypotheses why biodiversity increases closer to the equator. So the greater age of the ecosystems in the tropics versus the temperate region is one hypothesis. They were largely devoid of life during the last ice age and provides more time for speciation. There's greater energy at the tropics because they receive their sun energy much more directly than the lesser energy input up at the temperate regions. The complexity of tropical ecosystems can promote speciation by increasing the habitat heterogeneity, or the number of ecological niches in the tropics relative to the higher latitudes. Greater heterogeneity provides more opportunities for coevolution between different species, specialization, and perhaps greater selection pressures leading to population differentiation. Populations tend to differentiate into different species, or speciation occurs much more readily there. So problem, despite the hypotheses, the potential for biodiversity loss is greatest in the tropics, where there's more biodiversity due to human activity. The importance of biodiversity. Importance as related to human health. Our medicines are derived from natural chemicals, and many plants produce secondary plant compounds, which are toxins used to protect the plant from insects and other animals that eat them, but then we can use these chemicals for our medicines. And we're not the first to do so. Other great apes, even orangutans, chimpanzees, bonobos, and gorillas have all been observed self-medicating with plants. There's significant medicines derived from plant compounds, including aspirin, codeine, digoxin, atropine, and vincristine. 25% of modern drugs contain at least one plant extract. It decreased to about 10% as natural plant ingredients are replaced by synthetic versions of the plant compounds. Another drug, antibiotics, which are responsible for extraordinary improvements in health and lifespans in developed countries, are compounds largely derived from fungi and bacteria. And 35% of new drugs brought to market between 1981 to 2002 were from natural compounds. Then there's also something you might not think of, but the regenerative benefits of natural landscapes, just having them there. All of these are important to human health. Here's the Madagascar periwinkle. It has various medicinal properties. It's a source of vincristine, a drug used for the treatment of lymphomas, a type of cancer. Importance of diversity is related to agriculture. The ability to create new crop varieties relies on the diversity of varieties available and the availability of wild forms related to the crop plant. Crops and plants provide ecosystem services, and wild forms are often the source of new gene variants that can be bred with existing varieties to create varieties with new attributes. The loss of wild species related to a crop will mean the loss of potential crop improvement. Maintaining the genetic diversity of wild species related to domestic species ensures our continued supply of food. So since the 1920s, government agricultural departments have maintained seed banks of crop varieties as a way to help maintain our crop diversity. Over time, though, unfortunately, some of the seed varieties have been lost due to accidents at these seed banks. Other key ecosystem services related to food production are plant pollination and crop pest control. Biodiversity of pest enemies helps control pests that threaten our crops. Here's a global seed vault that stores seeds for Earth's diverse crops. You might see these in places like Norway where it's cold. The importance of biodiversity as related to wild food sources, such as wild fish populations. About 1 billion people use aquatic resources to provide the main source of animal protein in their diet. Since 1990, the global fisheries, production from global fisheries has declined. Fishery extinctions lead to restructuring of the marine ecosystem, in which a dominant species is so overharvested that it becomes a minor player ecologically. In addition, humans lose food sources. These alterations affect many other species in other ways that we can hardly even predict. The collapse of fisheries has dramatic and long-lasting effects on local human populations that work in the fishery industry. In addition, the loss of an inexpensive protein source to populations that cannot afford to replace it will increase the cost of living and limit societies in other ways as well. In general, the fish taken from fisheries have shifted to smaller species, and the larger species are overfished. The ultimate outcome could clearly be the loss of aquatic systems as food sources. So the main threats to biodiversity include habitat loss, overharvesting, exotic species, and climate change. We'll discuss all four of these. The core threat to biodiversity, therefore our human welfare, is the combination of human population growth and the resources used by that population. Looking at atmospheric carbon dioxide levels that fluctuate in a cyclical manner, this graph shows that with carbon dioxide concentration in parts per million on this axis and years before present on the x-axis. The burning of fossil fuels in recent history has caused a dramatic increase in the levels of carbon dioxide in Earth's atmosphere, which has now reached levels never before seen on Earth. Scientists predict that the addition of these greenhouse gases to the atmosphere is resulting in climate change that will significantly impact biodiversity in the coming century. Look how high it is here compared to the other spikes that have happened in Earth's history. So our threats to biodiversity, let's look at habitat loss first. And human destruction of habitats causes habitat loss, and we'll look at some examples. The habitat loss in Sumatra and Borneo threaten the orangutan, the elephant that's there, and the Sumatran tiger. The causes of extinction of species unique to an area. Amphibians are declining in numbers more than other groups because they have parts of their life cycle that involve both aquatic and terrestrial habitats during their lifetime. And excessive soil erosion after the removal of forests causes desertification. All of this examples here of habitat loss, which then causes biodiversity loss. There is a greenbelt movement striving to replant trees after deforestation. However, one of the individuals responsible for this has since died. Here's an oil palm plantation in Borneo. It replaces the native forest habitat that a variety of species depended on to live. Next, another threat to biodiversity, overharvesting. This is a threat to many species, especially aquatic species. Let's look at some examples. Fishers have little restraint on the overharvesting of fish. It can lead to something called the tragedy of the commons. You run out of resources. Whales and sharks are very vulnerable to overfishing and extinction because they're a larger species. Coral reefs suffer decline in biodiversity from the pet trade. And bushmeat. This is wild animals killed for food. They're now being made available in grocery stores. It used to be just families that lived in an area would eat bushmeat, but now they're being overharvested to supply food for grocery stores for everyone. And that can include the great apes in Africa. People eating them as bushmeat. Here's an example of an endangered species, the harlequin frog. It's died from a fungal disease, and the red lesions are symptomatic of that disease. A brown tree snake, which is an exotic species that has caused numerous extinctions on the island of Guam since its accidental introduction in 1950. The little brown bat. from Vermont was found to have something called white nose syndrome, another fungus who is an exotic species. So those are some examples of exotic species. So some examples for the exotic species. Another threat to biodiversity includes species that have been introduced by humans into ecosystems. Sometimes it's accidental, sometimes it's not accidental. So the lakes and islands are particularly vulnerable, like Lake Victoria. Nile perch that were introduced are responsible for extinction of 200 species of cichlids there. Again, I just showed you the picture of the brown tree snake in Guam in 1950, led to extinction of 3 bird species and up to 5 reptile species that were endemic to the island. Closer to home, ships dumping ballast water have helped the spread of zebra mussels in the Great Lakes and beyond. And the fungus from Africa, which was introduced, causes the disease, I can't even say that word, Ch21, which threatens amphibians globally. Remember, with exotic species, when they're introduced into an area, they did not evolve there, so they don't have pressures on them like predators and such, so they thrive there, while the other species who did evolve there have pressures on them, selective pressures like predators and such, and other controls. And then this exotic species comes in and outcompetes them, which then decreases biodiversity. Another threat to biodiversity, climate change. Anthropogenic, that means human-caused warming, the trend presently underway, which is a major extinction threat. So some examples: past and continuing emissions of greenhouse gases, including carbon dioxide, which is CO2, and CH4, which is methane, from burning fossil fuels and deforestation, changes our Earth's climate and its energy balance. There's a debate and lack of understanding that still occurs with this, and estimates of 15 to 40 of the species will go extinct by, or 15 to 40% of species will go extinct by 2050. I forgot to add the percent sign there. Climate change shifts colder climates north, and then changes regional climates and throws off the delicate timing adaptations that organisms possess, like when they should mate, or when they should hibernate, when they should migrate. These things all become affected when they should have their growing season. Ocean levels will rise due to the melting of glaciers and greater volume of warmer water, and islands may disappear, be covered with water, shorelines affected as water moves up further on the shorelines, and an overabundance of salt water and a shortage of fresh water could result with climate change. Here's an effect of global warming that can be seen to the continuing retreat of the Grinnell Glacier. The mean annual temperature in Glacier National Park has increased 1.33 degrees Celsius since 1900, and the loss of a glacier results in the loss of summer meltwaters, sharply reducing seasonal water supplies and severely affecting local ecosystems. So just take a look at the differences as time has gone on. So how do we preserve biodiversity? It's a huge challenge. Lost my picture here. There we go. It's a huge challenge, and it must be met by greater understanding of biodiversity itself. It must be met by changes in human behaviors and beliefs, and various preservation strategies. So the number of species on Earth is a result of an equilibrium of speciation and extinction, and they have fluctuated over time, as we've seen in the fossil record. So it's a natural birth and death processes of macroevolution. So for example, when the speciation rate is more than the extinction rate, the number of species increases. So there have been, as we can see with the fossil record and Earth strata, there have been about 5 major mass extinctions in Earth's history. This is when greater than half of the extant or existing species are disappearing from the fossil record. So they're there in the fossil record, then all of a sudden, no more. So the last mass extinction occurred 65 million years ago. This is when the dinosaurs disappeared. And we also have evidence that this was caused due to a large asteroid impact in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. So we can take a look at when the last mass extinctions occurred. Of course, this is when there would be sudden and dramatic losses of biodiversity. Here and here, a huge one here, they called this the Great Dying. Here, and then this one when the dinosaurs died out. A 6th mass extinction is argued to be underway as we speak, due to the activity of humans. This possibly started in the 1500s with the expansion of European colonies. So examples of extinctions in the last 500 years have made a list called the Red List. So one organism on that is the dodo bird. It's an example of an extinction around 1662 due to sailors hunting it for its meat. Because it was from an island and did not evolve with humans, it was not afraid of humans. You could walk right up to it, and so therefore it was an easy target for a meal for sailors. The stellar sea cow went extinct in 1768. It took only 27 years since it was discovered by humans to its extinction. It was hunted for meat and oil. The passenger pigeon went extinct in 1914 due to overhunting and clearing of forest for farmland, so habitat destruction. So that's just a few examples that are on the red list. And of course, these are organisms that are larger and more noticeable by humans. Imagine all of the ones going extinct that we don't even notice. There's the dodo bird. So extinction rates at the present day are difficult to estimate, as many happen without being observed. We tend to notice the big mammals or the birds, but it's the smaller things like insects, amphibians, and funguses, bacteria that we don't notice. The background extinction rate is estimated to be 1 per million species years, E over MSY, million species years. That's what that stands for. So 1 species year is 1 species in existence for 1 year. 1 million species years could be 1 species persisting for 1 million years, or 1 million species persisting for 1 year. For example, if there's 10 million species in existence, then we would expect 10 of those species to become extinct in 1 year. That would be the background rate. Currently, the predicted rate at the end of the century will be 1,500 extinctions per million species years. Another approach, a second approach, is to correlate species loss with habitat loss based on measuring forest area loss and understanding species area relationships. Species area relationship is the rate at which new species are seen when the area surveyed is increased. If the habitat area is reduced, the number of species will also decline. It suggests 90% of habitat loss causes 50% of species to become extinct. check out the next figure on the next slide. So recent work has also called into question the applicability of the species area relationship when estimating the loss of species. This work argues that the species area relationship leads to an overestimation of extinction rates. Using an alternate method would bring estimates down to about 500 E over MSY in the coming century, but note that this is still 500 times the background rate. It's still a huge amount, even if we are overestimating. So here's the typical species area curve showing the accumulation of the number of species found as more and more area is sampled. So the curve has been interpreted to show the effect on species numbers of destroying habitat. A reduction in habitat of 90% from 100 kilometers squared to 10 kilometers squared reduces the number of species supported by about 50%. So there is an area of ecology called conservation biodiversity, conservation biology as well. So threats to biodiversity at the genetic, species, and ecosystem levels have been recognized for some time. In the U.S., the first national park with land set aside to remain in a wilderness state was Yellowstone Park in 1890, that long ago. We knew there was something up. Today, the main efforts to preserve biodiversity involve legislative approaches to regulate human and corporate behavior, like setting aside protected areas and habitat restoration. So legislation includes international treaties as well as national and state laws to protect species. So here's some examples. The Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, also known as CITES. The treaty came into force in 1975. The treaty and the national legislation that supports it provides a legal framework for preventing listed species from being transported across nations' borders, thus protecting them from being caught or killed in the first place when the purpose involves international trade. So listed species that are protected to one degree or another by the treaty number some 33,000 species. This is limited by countries actually enforcing this within their very own borders. In the United States, the Endangered Species Act was enacted in 1973. When an at-risk species is listed by this act, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is required by law to develop a management plan to protect the species and bring it back to sustainable numbers. It's often difficult, unfortunately, to get a species listed or to create an effective management plan for that species once it is listed. Additionally, species may be controversially taken off the list without necessarily having had a change in their situation. It focuses efforts on the few highly visible species that are maybe charismatic or that people care about. So perhaps the other species then go unprotected at the expense of these charismatic species. So what we're saying here is that even though these legislations are enacted, they're not perfect. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act, an agreement between the U.S. and Canada that was signed into law in 1918 in response to declines in North American bird species caused by hunting. So the act now lists over 800 protected species. It makes it illegal to disturb or kill the protected species or distribute its parts. So examples include northern cardinals, red-tailed hawks, and the American black vulture. The Kyoto Protocol, an international agreement that came out of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that committed countries to reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 2012, was ratified only by some countries. Two important countries that did not take part in this, United States and China. Some goals for reduction in greenhouse gases were met and exceeded by some of the individual countries, but worldwide, the effort to limit greenhouse gas production is not succeeding. The intended replacement for the Kyoto Protocol has not materialized because governments cannot agree on timelines or benchmarks. So the resulting cost to human societies and biodiversity predicted by a majority of climate scientists will be high. The non-profit, non-governmental sector plays a large role in conservation efforts both in North America and around the world. The approaches range from species to species organizations to broadly focused IUCN and trade records analysis of Florida and fauna in commerce, called traffic. The Nature Conservancy makes a novel approach, or takes a novel approach. It purchases land and protects it in an attempt to set up preserves for ecosystems. Ultimately, human behavior will change when human values change. At present, the growing urbanization of the human population is a force that mitigates against valuing biodiversity because many people no longer come into contact with natural environments anymore and the species that inhabit them, so they don't care about natural species or biodiversity. The national park, like the Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming, helps to conserve biodiversity. It's one of the key tools in conservation efforts. It's a preserve, an area of land set aside with varying degrees of protection for the organisms that exist within its boundaries. They can be effective, but can have serious drawbacks as well. But definitely a beautiful place, a beautiful picture. Conservation International has identified 34 biodiversity hotspots. Although these cover only 2.3% of Earth's surface, 42% of the terrestrial vertebrate species, and 50% of the world's plants are endemic to those hotspots. A biodiversity hotspot is a conservation concept developed by Norman Myers in 1988. Hotspots are geographical areas that contain high numbers of endemic species, and the purpose of the concept was to identify important locations of the planet to focus our conservation efforts. Looks like Minnesota here is not one of the hotspots. Notice how many of the hotspots are around the tropical equatorial regions. Habitat restoration. Restoration can improve the biodiversity of degraded ecosystems. So I'm going to read a story here. I pasted in the whole story because I thought the whole thing was important as a wonderful example of how restoration can help improve biodiversity in places where they had been degraded. And this is kind of a test that shows us what we need to do to help other areas as well. So reintroducing wolves, a top predator, to Yellowstone National Park occurred in 1995, led to dramatic changes in the ecosystem that increased biodiversity. The wolves, check their picture out in the next slide, function to suppress elk and coyote populations and provide more abundant resources to the guild of carrion eaters. Reducing elk populations has allowed revegetation of riparian, the areas along the banks of a stream or river, those areas, which has increased the diversity of species in the habitat. Suppression of coyotes has increased the species previously suppressed by this predator, and the number of species of carrion eaters has increased because of the predatory activities of the wolves. In this habitat, the wolf is a keystone species, meaning a species that's instrumental in maintaining diversity within the ecosystem. Removing a keystone species from an ecological community causes a collapse in biodiversity. The results from the Yellowstone experiment suggest that restoring a keystone species effectively can have the effect of restoring biodiversity in the community. ecologists have argued for the identification of keystone species where possible, and for focusing protection efforts on those species. It makes sense to return the keystone species to the ecosystems where they have been removed. It will help bring back the biodiversity and help heal that ecosystem. So there is a picture of wolves in Yellowstone from 2007. They are a keystone species. How about the role of zoos in captive breeding? Finally, kind of hit one of our last ideas to help bring back biodiversity. Can zoos help us? Zoos have sought to play a role in conservation efforts, both through captive breeding programs and educating people about the importance of organisms and biodiversity. The transformation of the missions of zoos from just kind of being collectors and exhibitors, transferring them to being organizations that are dedicated to conservation. This process is ongoing. So education is a potential positive impact of zoos on conservation efforts, particularly given the global trend that many people don't come into contact with wild and natural species or natural areas. So a number of studies have been performed to look at the effectiveness of zoos on people's attitudes and actions regarding conservation. And at present, those results tend to be mixed. And our last picture here, the golden lion tamarin here. Zoos and captive breeding programs help preserve many endangered species, like this one pictured here. That finishes us up for Chapter 21. Again, I always encourage you to take a look at the end of the chapter questions and try to answer those. Go through the critical thinking questions as well. Go back and read the chapter, read through the notes, listen to the lectures, and let me know if you have any questions, and we'll see you next time.